Our New England ancestors were canny enough that they weren't going to sign up for lands that they hadn't had a good report of. So they sent their committee. And I want to quote from an article by the Reverend Jacob Whitman Cox in his sketch of the Congregational Church of Cornwallis. He wrote about the committee landing over at Stars Point. He says, the country was in its best dress. The diked meadows of Grand Pre and Canard were all dressed in living green, and the Acadian orchards and gardens were glorious, with apple and cherry and plum trees in full array of blossoms. The committee were charmed with the prospects. Well, a year later, on June the 4th, 1780, hundreds of 1760, sorry. Maybe if I move that a little bit, it won't be between me and the manuscript. In 1760, hundreds of New England planters arrived from Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And I often think about what they must have thought, getting off those 22 ships at Horton Landing and Stars Point. We know that they couldn't have come into this province at a better time of year. The report that went back to Connecticut with the vessels was that they liked the lands far better than expected. That's good. Now, you folks are gathered here because you're connected one way or another with the Cogswell family. The ancestor of the Kings County Cogswells was Hezekiah Cogswell. He was born in Connecticut in 1709. How many of you, just show of hands, are descended from Hezekiah? Oh yeah, really? Good number. Thank you. If I've counted correctly, he's the 5th generation from John Cogswell, who came from England to Ipswich, Mass. in 1635. Now, you can feel good about the fact that the Cogswells are among the founding English-speaking settlers of 2 countries, what are today the United States and Canada. The information that is recorded in that big red book, that Cogswell genealogy, tells that John and Elizabeth Cogswell and their 8 children came from Westbury in southwestern England to Ipswich, Massachusetts on the ship the Angel Gabriel in 1635. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you folks about the storm and the shipwreck. That's gotta be family lore that's passed to every child because it's a wonderful story. They had a rough time, but they all survived, and that's the best part of it. They seem to have lived for a generation or so in Ipswich, Massachusetts, before relocating to Connecticut. First to Saybrook, and then some of them to Canterbury, and finally to Lebanon, Connecticut, before they decided to take up the offer of land grants in Nova Scotia and became New England planters. Now let me tell you a little bit about the New England planters in Nova Scotia. What is a planter? Well, first let me tell you what it's not. It's not a loyalist or Tory. The American Revolution was still over 15 years in the future. The Boston Tea Party hadn't happened. Concord and Lexington were just 2 little towns west Boston. The word planter in this sense doesn't have anything to do with agriculture either, although many of them were farmers. Planter is an old English word which means colonist. Planters planted colonies for Great Britain. And the word was applied to this group much later by historians who were looking for a name for this significant group of people, which would distinguish them from the Halifax merchants who came 10 years or so earlier, and the Loyalists who came 15 to 20 years later. Now, we've all heard about the 13 colonies at the time of the American Revolution. Actually, England had 16 colonies in North America. There were the 13 that would become rebellious colonies, and there was Quebec and Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. And the colony of Nova Scotia made up what is now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. So it was a good sized chunk of land. This is the land of the Mi'kmaq, Glooscaps people. The French were the first Europeans to settle here, and they called this land Acadie. They were and are Acadians. And their descendants in Louisiana are called the Cajuns. Yeah. In addition to the Acadian farmers and fisherfolk, the French had built a fortress at Louisbourg in Cape Breton, and there's a marvelous recreation of that if you are heading that direction. Louisbourg was a convenient location for the French because it's far enough out in the Atlantic that it gave the French warships a wonderful port from which to disrupt navigation between London and Boston. France and Britain had been at war for a good part of the century, and this was a major threat to both England and New England. The tensions culminated in 1755 with the infamous expulsion of the Acadians, which was chronicled in Longfellow's poem Evangeline. Now, less than half of the Acadians were actually rounded up and deported. It was awful. It was a dreadful chapter in our history. Others, though, were forced to leave their fertile dikes and farmlands and retreat to less fertile areas, like the French shore in Yarmouth County, and northwestern Cape Breton, and northern New Brunswick. Within a very few years, though, it became obvious to the British officials in Halifax and in London, and perhaps most of all in Boston, that if England was going to keep Nova Scotia as a colony, and that was considered vital to the security of New England and New York, it would have to be settled by English-speaking people. And it was agreed that settlers should be sought not from England, where there was an industrial revolution going on and they didn't want to lose the workforce, but from New England, where the climate and conditions were similar and where there was a shortage of good land for the growing population. Now, a common literary form in the 1700s was the tract. There were political tracts and there were lots of religious tracts, but there were also documents known as colonization tracts. And these were little pamphlets encouraging emigration and settlement in various parts of the empire. Nova Scotia was not neglected in this literary genre. Some of the offerings, however, were, let's say, less than encouraging. It's probably a wonder that Nova Scotia isn't still an unpopulated wilderness. Let me read to you from this tract entitled A True Account of the Colonies of Nova Scotia and Georgia, 1774. Why they would be doing Nova Scotia and Georgia. Anyway, this is the Nova Scotia bit. The climate of this country, though within the temperate zone, has been found rather unfavorable to European constitutions. They are wrapped up in the gloom of fog during the greatest part of the year. The fogs come off the sea and sometimes in an instant envelop every object in obscure darkness. From such an unfavorable climate, little can be expected. Nova Scotia is almost a continued forest, and agriculture, though attempted by the English settlers, has hitherto made little progress. In most parts, the soil is thin and barren, and the grass intermixed with cold, spongy moss. My theory is that they landed at Halifax in April. Obviously, the author of that tract was more interested in finding colonists for Georgia than Nova Scotia. The New England planters must have had more promising accounts, and they did, because they applied to come in sufficient numbers. Close to 2,500 families, comprising over 8,000 individuals, made their ways from southern New England to Nova Scotia during the 15 years between 1760 and the beginning of the American Revolution in 1775. The settlement process was begun by Governor Charles Lawrence in October 1758. He issued a proclamation which was published in the Boston newspapers. This document stated simply that lands in the province of Nova Scotia had been vacated by the English military victories, and the government would respond favorably to proposals to repopulate the area. This description of Nova Scotia, which accompanied the proclamation, differed significantly from the one in the colonization tract. It said the lands were consisting of upwards of 100,000 acres of interval plough lands, which had been cultivated for more than 100 years past and never fail of crops, nor need manuring. Also, more than 100,000 acres of upland, cleared and stocked with English grass, planted with orchards, gardens, etc. The wild and unimproved lands adjoining to the above are well timbered and wooded. All these lands are so intermixed that every single farmer may have a proportionate quantity of plowland, grassland, and woodland, and all are situated about the Bay of Fundy upon rivers navigable for ships of burden. Some of